Starting into chapter 10, we are going to talk about blood and the circulatory system and then some disorders of the blood. And all of the other things that we've talked about up until now require the circulatory system in order to function. So we talked about fluid and electrolyte imbalances and acid-base imbalances and the immune system and the inflammatory response. All those things require some kind of medium in order for those hormones and signaling chemicals and white blood cells and everything else to travel in, and that's our circulatory system. So the circulatory system is constantly interacting with all of the other systems in the body in order to keep things communicating. So it's hugely important, right? It's a big, important system. The blood circulates in the circulatory system as a way of transporting oxygen and nutrients to all the tissues, removing waste products from cellular metabolism, and just maintaining homeostasis with fluid stasis and fluid balance and electrolyte imbalance, and the hormone system, the endocrine system, which we'll talk about in a little bit, which keeps everything in balance. So if it weren't for the circulatory system, none of that stuff would work. So when we talk about cells sending out chemical signals to call other cells to the area, that's how they get there. They get there via the circulatory system. So I split this up into different PowerPoints, and just for this PowerPoint, we're going to review blood and the terms describing blood and abnormalities in the blood. So then in the next section, this week and next week, we'll talk about blood and lymph. In the next section, we're going to talk about the cardiovascular system, which, of course, blood and lymph are an important part of. Blood disorders terminology, of course, like everything in this class, there's tons of terminology. There are Quizlets for all these different terms if you want to study the Quizlets. They're linked in the Canvas module. So a dyscrasia is any abnormality of the blood or bone marrow, particularly having to do with cells. So abnormal cell characteristics or abnormal numbers of cells. So too many cells or not enough cells. So cytosis is a condition where there are too many of a certain type of cell. Penia is a location where there are not enough types of an individual cell. So erythrocytosis, too many erythrocytes, too many red blood cells. Leukocytosis, too many white blood cells. Leukopenia, not enough white blood cells. Neutropenia, not enough of neutrophils in the blood. The reason this one is separated out from the other ones is you'll see that a lot in people who are undergoing cancer treatment. You'll see that they have neutropenic precautions, meaning you have to take extra isolation precautions because the neutrophils are a big player in the immune response. And if you don't have enough of them, you're in trouble, potentially. Pancytopenia, pan means all, cytocelpenia, not enough of them. So decrease in all blood cells, erythrocytes, leukocytes, and thrombocytes. Thrombocytopenia is an abnormally low number of thrombocytes or platelets, so you have a trouble with clotting if you have thrombocytopenia. So that can be a problem, obviously. More terminology. Ecchymoses are reddish blue discolorations of the skin or mucosa because of bleeding. It's a bruise. It looks like a bruise. However, what we generally call a bruise or a contusion comes from the outside. So something hitting you from the outside. Somebody hit you with a softball, hopefully not, but and you get a bruise. Ecchymoses come from the inside. So there's abnormal internal bleeding, and that's where you're getting the ecchymoses. Heme arthrosis, heme is blood, arthro is joint, and osis is a condition. So it's a condition of bleeding into the joint cavity. Hemolysis, lysis is breaking something down. It's the destruction of erythrocytes. So in the immune system chapter, we talked about a cytotoxic or hemolytic sensitivity reaction, like to an incompatible blood transfusion. It's a type 2 hypersensitivity reaction. It causes the destruction of erythrocytes. There are other conditions that cause the destruction of erythrocytes or hemolysis, and we'll talk about it. Hemoptysis is frothy sputum containing streaks of blood. And I know I have this later in one of the other PowerPoints, but I didn't put it on this list. Epitaxis is a nosebleed. Also sometimes associated with clotting disorders. Hypochromic, hypo is below, chromic is color. So it's red blood cells that have less color than normal, and that's caused by iron deficiency. So iron causes the red in the red blood cell, and it's in the hemoglobin group. So if you don't have enough of it, like in iron deficiency, iron deficient anemia, your red blood cells can be hypochromic. They don't have as much color. Megablasts are abnormally large, nucleated, immature erythrocytes. So mature erythrocytes don't have nuclei, but these guys do. So they're an indicator of another problem. Microcytic blood cells are tiny, tiny little red blood cells. They're unusually small. So that is a problem too, and it's indicative of a different condition. Petechiae are tiny pinpoint hemorrhages under the skin. In the third PowerPoint, I have some photographs of them, and there are some photographs in the book. They are also indicative of abnormal bleeding. They can be caused by external things too, just like bruises, but petechiae are one of the things we're looking for. With things like snake bites or scorpion bites, some of the venom can has an effect on clotting, and it can cause petechiae. That can be indicative of a venomous bite. So all of these are sort of things that they're looking at, and they're trying to put them together and figure out what's going on. So the circulatory system consists of the cardiovascular system, the heart and the veins and the arteries and capillaries, and the lymphatic system. So the lymphatic system goes hand in hand with the circulatory system or the cardiovascular system, and it's all the fluid and blood that circulates in the body goes through these systems. So we're going to cover blood vessels and blood and associated disorders, and in the next chapter, we are going to cover lymph and lymph disorders. So the blood vessels, as I'm sure you know at this point, arteries go away from the heart, veins go towards the heart. Arteries are the bigger version, arterioles are as they get smaller and smaller as they go out. Veins are the bigger version, and then venules get smaller and smaller as they go out. Capillaries are where veins and arteries connect. It's the microcirculation within the tissue, and capillaries are one endothelial cell thick. So they're really thin, and that's where things get exchanged. That's in our systemic circulation. So the systemic circulation is exchanges of gases, nutrients, and wastes in the tissues, and that happens in the capillary beds. And as we talked in the inflammatory response, we want to get more things in and out, and so more capillary beds open up so we can increase that systemic circulation. A lot of the autonomic nervous system is concerned with maintaining the proper amount of circulation and keeping the blood in the right places. So a lot of the dilation and constriction of blood vessels is controlled by the autonomic nervous system. And the pulmonary circulation is gas exchange in the lungs, also very important. It's where we exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen, and so we can get it out into the systemic circulation. So veins and arteries have layers of tissue, which, that's a good thing. The tunica intima is the endothelial layer. It's the inner layer. That inner layer, the capillaries are just endothelium. And they're usually one cell thick. The tunica media is the layer of smooth muscle that controls the diameter of the blood vessel. It's the middle layer. That smooth muscle is what's controlled by the autonomic nervous system to either constrict or dilate the blood vessels as needed. The tunica externa or tunica adventitia is the outer connective tissue. It's elastic. It contains collagen fibers for strength, and it's type 1 collagen. And it has fibrocytes, which are cells that are creating the collagen and the elastin to kind of maintain status quo there. So the blood vessels themselves have tiny blood vessels that supply them with blood and nutrients. So crazy, right? But you got to have it. You just absolutely got to have it. And the vasa vasorum are the tiny blood vessels that supply the tissues of the blood vessel itself. So normally the arteries are larger, they're very elastic because they adjust to changes in blood volume that occur during the systole and diastole of the cardiac cycle. So the aorta has to expand during systole to prevent the systolic pressure from rising too high. And so veins are thinner than arteries generally, or have thinner walls, and they have less smooth muscle than the arteries because they don't have to expand and contract as much. However, veins do have valves in them to prevent backflow of blood. So veins and arteries are very similar, but they're not exactly the same. And so when they're doing like coronary artery bypass grafts and things, sometimes they use a vein, sometimes they use an artery. The arterial version generally lasts better because the artery is more elastic and kind of tougher, so it's I guess they decide person by person how they're going to do it when they do a coronary artery bypass graft. So blood itself is composed of plasma and cellular components. So the plasma is the fluid component of blood, and the cellular component are, the cells that are floating around in there, doing their business, doing their cell business. So when you see a micrograph like this of a microscopic blood smear, and there's some diagnostic testing that's done with a blood smear. We'll talk about it in a couple minutes. But you see the little ones that are pink on the outside and sort of pale in the middle, those are the erythrocytes, the red blood cells. The big purple ones, and they're purple because of the stain that they use. With the multi-lobed nuclei, those are leukocytes, white blood cells. And the itty-bitty little shadowy guys, those are thrombocytes, or platelets. So they're all in there, they're all in the blood, doing their jobs that they need to do. So this is the cellular components of blood. So the human body contains about 5 liters of blood. So the blood is the water and the dissolved solutes, which are about 55, and that's the fluid component of blood. They're about 55% of the whole blood volume. The cellular component is about 45%. And erythrocytes, leukocytes, thrombocytes, platelets. Of course, the biggest proportion of that 45% is made up of erythrocytes. They're out there transporting oxygen and hemoglobin. That's their main job. They live about 120 days, erythrocytes do, and then they're recycled in the spleen. Leukocytes are divided into 2 different types, granulocytes and agranulocytes. Granulocytes are the neutrophils, eosinophils, and basionophils. Those are largely concerned with inflammatory response, immune response, and allergic responses. So one of the ways they can tell you're having an allergic reaction when they do a complete blood count, you have increased eosinophils. That's an allergic response. Agranulocytes are the lymphocytes and monocytes. Monocytes grow into macrophages, which do phagocytosis. Lymphocytes are involved, of course, in everything. They have their hand in everything, right? Cell-mediated immunity and humoral immunity. So our B lymphocytes and our T lymphocytes, all those guys come in with that. So lots of cells doing lots of good work in the body, right? When we talk about the hematocrit, that is the proportion, the percent of the blood that's made up of cells. Males tend to have a higher hematocrit, averaging between 40 and 50, 42 and 52%, if you want to say that. Females tend to have an average of 37 to 48%. If you are working with someone in the hospital who just had surgery, they might have a lower hematocrit, so they have less. They have fewer red blood cells transporting oxygen, so they might get dizzy when you stand them up. That's a nice number to look at. Even if you don't look at any other labs, look at their hematocrit, and get an idea of whether or not they're going to be dizzy when you stand them up. And if they have a low hematocrit, check in with them often on whether or not they feel dizzy. That's pretty important. So once you take the cells out of blood, you have the fluid components. And so plasma makes up about 55% of the whole blood volume. It contains water, you know, and it looks a clear yellowish fluid. And it contains proteins and then all the other stuff that's floating around the blood that's not cells. So amino acids, carbohydrates, lipids, vitamins, hormones, enzymes, electrolytes, waste from cellular metabolism. All of those things are floating around in the fluid component of blood. And all of those things, when they do blood chemistry analysis, that's what they're testing for usually. The proteins dissolved in blood include albumin, which is largely responsible for the osmotic pressure of blood. Remember, we talked about how osmotic pressure is influencing fluid movement between the individual compartments. Globulins are antibodies. Fibrinogen is involved in blood clotting. Anything that ends in IN or EN is usually a protein. Albumin, globulin, fibrinogen. There are a few other ones floating around in there, too small to mention. That's in the ingredients. That's the other ingredients, other natural ingredients. Okay. So in the next section, we'll talk about blood cell development and blood therapies. So obviously there are therapies involved with blood.